That grave is mine. Jacob sat down at his usual bench at his usual hour, at sunset, in front of his usual gravestone in the cemetery close to his house. In his usual haunt, in this case in the form of a cemetery, in his predictable vacation mountain town, Jacob crossed his legs and placed his hands in his lap, respectfully addressing the gravestone of a Mrs. Junia Christina, a woman who had been buried so long in this particular boneyard that the moss had long since grown over her inscriptions beneath her name. Judging by the age of the stone, she had been buried there for some time, even though he couldn't confirm a birth or death date, or if she'd been a beloved mother or grandmother. Maybe she had died as a toddler. Jacob could only speculate, but it didn't matter anyway. All that mattered is that her final resting place was situated directly in front of his favorite bench in his favorite graveyard, in his least favorite town in the world. Somehow he knew that out of all the countless hours he'd spent in front of her gravestone, every evening after clocking out of work at his grocery job, that his words had never fallen on deaf ears. There had always been an unmistakable presence leaning on his spoken utterances, as if she was there to share the bench with him, an arm across the back behind him. Well, Junia, you were right. I should have trusted my gut, Jacob said with a sigh. He tossed the picked wildflowers he'd gathered on his walk to the graveyard at the foot of her stone marker. The hush that followed, where not even the crickets answered, told him she was listening. It was too soon for us to have joined our bank accounts, he continued. She took everything. Somewhere a crow cawed, and he couldn't help but think that this was a sign that the world was laughing at him. He guessed that he deserved it. He'd been too trusting of people. He'd never trusted the media, doctors, or the preachers at his parents' church, as all those people wanted him to change his opinions in some way. But he had come to realize in the last few months, jumping into a relationship with a girl he had met at the beach, professing their love, moving in together within a week, and setting a marriage date, that his weakness was not his head or his gut. In fact, both of these pieces of anatomy had screamed at him to slow down and walk the other way. No, it was his heart that failed him every time. You know, my dad told me once that this world is full of good people, Jacob explained. I don't believe that anymore. The Vedics say that this is the Kali Yuga, where over 70% of the people are infested by demons. I know that's true now. People lie to your face, promising you everything, and then justify their misdeeds somehow. I might agree that most people have empathy and love their families, but backed into a corner, they'll turn on their loved ones. Fear is what infects every man and woman I meet, and I'm part of the 30% that are actually real. Maybe you were too, Junia. I like to think we could have been good together. He thought he heard something rustle in the leaves behind him. He turned his head to glance out at the open field behind the cemetery. Sometimes he thought he'd glimpsed orbs of light out there among the trees and tall brush, but he had a difficult time passing them off as fireflies in the night. He also didn't think they were spirits, even though he was in a graveyard. No, he didn't believe in ghosts, not like most people did. In fact, he believed he was a ghost, as the world that had ensnared him was most definitely hell. The demons that surrounded him were positive enough proof for him, let alone the food designed to make him sick, the entertainment pushing ultra-violence and gratuitous sex, and the media that lied to its audiences in the guise of national security. But there was nothing behind him. There were no lights or tourists cutting through the woods. It was past Columbus Day, and that meant all the vacationers had gone home. Every year his mountain lakefront town faced a severe lull, which was almost mind-numbing. 7 months out of the year, his main street was a revolving door where endless floods of people pushed their way inside for a kiss of sun and a touch of lake water as warm as a bath. But now it was strange to see the streets and shops so empty, like a rapture had struck, and he was left behind to suffer in his ghost town, his own private hell forever. He thought it was all fitting in light of his new mindset. The town might as well feel as dead as he now did. Junia, you're the lucky one. Wherever you are, you're free from this. At least I hope. Maybe we're destined to live our lives over and over again. I don't know. If that's the case, then you're still in this hell with me, somewhere. He blew a kiss at her gravestone and stood up to leave. This time he did catch a movement of light in the corner of his eye and turned to look. It was like looking through a foggy mirror. Everything seemed to be under murky water, and he even pushed his hands through what he thought might be an actual see-through veil, but his fingers only touched air. Passing it off as a trick of light in the falling dusk, he moved on, down the deserted main street and back into his home where he hoped to smother his sorrows with deep, dreamless sleep. Halloween was quickly approaching, and when he couldn't sleep, he looked out his window at the still streets and alleyways. Something compelled him to turn on the TV to occupy his mind and perhaps distract his thoughts for long enough to plunge him into oblivion. Sitting there in his reclining chair, he turned on the local news and watched as a young weather girl, cute, blonde, and trim, gave the evening's forecast. Then he was sitting stock straight in his chair when he read the name that labeled her at the bottom of the screen, Junia Christina. But it wasn't even what she said that suddenly caused his chest to begin pounding with new surges of blood, pushing past the limits of his maximum capacity, to the point where he thought he might get what he wished for anyway and pass out right there in front of the screen. "And is it true you have a birthday coming up, Junia?" one of the anchors asked, with a mocking kind of sing-song tone. She smiled with hands on hips. "Oh, the secret's out then, is it?" The camera switched back to the anchor, pressed and prime in his suit and manicured haircut. "It's not that I just disclosed your age or anything," he replied with a dry, actor's grin. "That's no secret," she admitted. "Everyone in town knows I'm a millennium baby. I accidentally outed myself on live air last New Year's." They passed it off with more dull banter that quickly slam-cut to the waiting commercial break. Jacob was already out of his chair and staring out the window again, but now it was too dark to see any of the emptiness. Even the streetlights did little to penetrate the thickening shadows. There was no hope for him to get any sleep that night, he had already decided. The only thing that would settle his reeling mind would be one last meeting with the woman named Junia Christina, not the lady on the TV, but the corpse buried and almost forgotten at his local cemetery. It wasn't a common name, not there in the States. He'd even researched it once to see it was much more common in Scotland or any of the UK territories. What were the odds, really? He intended to find out. More than anything, he just needed to know. He wasn't sure if the answer would really settle his anxiety or intensify it. He stepped outside and didn't think twice walking down the middle of the road, certain that it would be his all the way to the cemetery, and it was. He didn't even run into a squirrel tearing through the trees. He had never been to the cemetery that late at night, and he hadn't accounted for the sheer lack of lamplight or the frigidness of the air, which wasn't kind to his bare arms and legs. He had never been frightened to be there before, and it wasn't the late night hours or the strange cast of bluish light that seemed to emanate from the moon in the sky. He had the feeling of being watched, similar to the presence he felt when talking to Junia, but nothing like this prickling sensation where hundreds of thoughts were now dedicated to him, as if he was giving a public speech in front of a stadium of people, all their hooks into him now. He had much difficulty finding Junia's gravestone in the dark, and he had to use the flashlight from his phone to clear the ivy from the marble in order to read the inscription. There it was, born 2000, died 2078. He checked the next gravestone, and the next. The latest date he found was 3003, and as soon as he saw that, he was reeling away from the square of freshest graves, tripping over the raised mounds in the grass, and gravitating naturally toward the open field, the darkest void yet. The space was so black that he had to stop and backtrack, setting his sights for the nearest streetlight on the corner. He heard more rustling behind him, but he resisted the urge to look. Certain that the graveyard was somehow a slip in time, a portal into the future, he began to pray for his safe transport back to 2023, back into the hell that he belonged to, not in this other realm that had swallowed the bodies of every man, woman, and child currently alive and asleep in their beds. He reached the main street and stood there under the buzzing streetlight, content with the October date displayed on his phone, and with the biting wind that seemed to pierce his very skin and chill his bones. Then he saw it. The same firefly-like orbs that he'd caught sight of in the field directly behind him, but now dancing down the street toward him. He found that he couldn't move, not while those lights hypnotized him, up and down, side to side, with the beginnings of a casual stride, left foot, right foot. And now the silhouettes of people were beginning to form, transparent and bluish bright in the moon's glow, and he started to see shoulders, heads, swinging arms. There were dozens of them, mostly featureless, but clear men and women, and even children, all dressed as if going to a funeral in their Sunday best. He retreated into the shadows, ducked down low in the ditch, but they weren't coming his way. They turned left into the graveyard, and he followed them with his eyes, approaching the waist-high wrought iron fence between him and them. He expected the specters to proceed past the graves and into the impenetrable shadows of the field, the only place he'd ever seen them before. but they began to fan out from the single file line and break off into small clusters, and then into lonely single orbs of light. Each one found their respective gravestone and disappeared into the ground. He even saw Junia, the cute weather girl from the TV, but now a hologram of who she used to be, but unmistakably her. She strode slow and deliberately, passing through several gravestones along the way and staring fixedly ahead of her. She did not stagger or shift her pace at all, stepping over the dips in the ground and walking on the air itself. Jacob hopped over the fence and skirted the outer exterior of the cemetery, matching her pace and maneuvering blindly, but certain of her destination. She passed through his favorite bench without flinching and sank into the recently cut grass covering her plot. He watched the top of her head disappear into the dirt. He was about to run again, but he became aware of more blinking lights, this time in the field, and as his eyes focused, he saw that they were people, luminescent like the other ghosts, but more solid, and unlike the brigade of souls parading down the main street, they noticed him, and they were even motioning for him to come closer. They were nicely dressed like the others, but there were so many more of them, and they had more defined features on their faces. Some of them were smiling, others looked concerned. Some were the epitome of youth, others glowed with a warm wisdom and kind age that instantly caused Jacob to relax his guard. They wanted him to come closer, but they didn't move to approach him. He could see the veil shimmering again, like that window glass, separating the graveyard from the clearing beyond. He was certain that they couldn't walk through. And when he had that thought, they were motioning more dramatically now, their mouths moving without sound. It seemed that they thought he could make it through, but he felt rooted to the spot suddenly. A light filled his peripherals again, and he turned to watch an exact double of himself, in a full tuxedo, pass within arm's length and proceed to the end of the nearest set of plots, at the stone marker at the very end, and he knew that the grave was his. "Hey!" he screamed, without knowing what else to say, and the night erupted with the sudden invasion of sound. The spectre sharing his image froze and turned slowly around. His features were blurred and unpronounced, but Jacob could tell that he was petrified to meet eyes with his exact double. His eyes widened and his aura of light dimmed. "You?" a shaky voice responded, seemingly from every direction at once, and Jacob recognized it as his own. "This is hell," Jacob screamed, speaking with more confidence than he'd ever mustered before. "Don't go that way. Turn around." He watched the image fade into nothing before his eyes, and he sprinted through the spot his double once stood to inspect the gravestone with a shaking flashlight beam. There he read, "Jacob Lowry, born March 1984, died December 2023. He dropped his phone between his feet and put the cemetery at his 6 o'clock, focusing once again on the field. It was no longer black, but midday on the other side of the glassy screen. And the people were not watching him anymore, but dancing with each other, chasing dogs, picnicking, and playing tag with children. He so wanted to push past the barrier separating this paradise from his sunless scene. But the mystery of his grave inscription had already taken root in his mind. His gut and his heart understood this time, but his head was now crippled by the mystery, and he fell on his hands and knees in front of his final resting place, grappling with his phone and searching the obituaries online for his own name. But he couldn't find it, and the date on his calendar told him it was 2023, but still October. He still had time. There was still so much for him to do, or to undo, there in hell. There was nowhere else he belonged, there in the prison cell of that town that he hated so much, and all the rest of the pitiful tourists and lost souls haunting the ugly streets. And he decided he would not miss the next midnight parade down Main Street.